Okay, ladies and gentlemen, happy Friday. I hope everyone had a nice day off on a beautiful fall day yesterday on All Saints' Day. Hopefully, everyone got to Mass. And obviously, as I said on Wednesday, I hope you all had a very happy but also safe Halloween on Wednesday. And always keep in mind if anyone is allergic to Kit Kats or Twix or Milky Ways or any other good candy, feel free to bring them into maybe a history teacher who isn't allergic to those. But we'll talk maybe more about that on Monday. But on a more serious note, on Wednesday, we left off introducing the idea of slavery here in the English colonies. And the English colonies were similar to other European colonies in that many of them would go on to import slaves, and slavery became part of the colonial culture here in the Western Hemisphere. Whether it was the Spanish colonies, whether it was the Portuguese colony of Brazil down in South America, or other parts of the Caribbean, the English colonies too became those that would be importing slaves. And to wrap your heads around the idea of 10 million people over the span of 300 years would have been drastically affected by that in the way that they were exported out of Africa and sold and distributed for means of cheap labor. And for the Atlantic slave trade itself, as we said, the Atlantic slave trade started in Africa, okay, with these families, with these men and women, and even children being impacted to a degree that is certainly unfortunate, in that they were taken from their homes and then sold at trading posts. And a lot of times, as we said on Wednesday, they were sold for other items, guns, manufactured goods, clothes, anything of value in Africa. People would trade humans for them, which is certainly a set of unfortunate circumstances here. But the big thing I want you to keep in mind that made the colonies unique, the English colonies, is that slaves who were purchased here, particularly in the southern colonies, they were purchased with the intentions of being slaves for life. This was not an opportunity for them to earn their freedom. This was not an opportunity for them to be released. This was the idea that they were going to come here to North America and work. And obviously, the horrors of being taken from their homes, that harsh reality is really just the beginning. Once these slaves were taken from their home and brought miles to the west coast of Africa, those trips on foot could take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks. They would be sold and put onto slave ships. And these ships, as if you were to ship over barrels of wheat or rice or whatever else, these slaves would be put onto these ships to be exported out of Africa and to the Western Hemisphere. As time wore on, that brutal voyage of the Atlantic slave trade from Africa to the Western Hemisphere became known as the Middle Passage, a 6 to 8 week journey of slaves being crammed in, because obviously slave owners want to make or slave ship owners want to make as much money as possible. They tried to get as many slaves on these ships at one time. And as I have here, the conditions were very much inhumane. You look at this picture here, an example of a slave ship where slaves were lined up shoulder to shoulder, all right, right on top of each other. Some ships had basically bunks, okay, and these weren't necessarily the greatest of conditions. I said on Wednesday, there was no benches or seats or sleeping quarters or hammocks. This was very much uncomfortable, and this was very much inhumane, all right, to treat people like this. Over the span of 300 years, historians estimate that approximately 15 to 20% of slaves, okay, that were exported out of Africa would either die or commit suicide. A lot of them refused to eat on these ships, and due to malnutrition and starvation, would wind up dying. Other slaves, when they were able to walk up top on the decks, would jump overboard, just because of not wanting to go back to where they would spend a vast majority of the day, down in the hull of the ship. And certainly a set of unfortunate circumstances. Well, for those slaves that did make the voyage, that did survive, now the slave ship owners would have auctions. And these auctions would put on display different Africans, and people would bid on them. And typically, young teenage, early 20 teenage boys would fetch a rather hefty price, with the idea that they would be strong and capable of work. Um, Younger children still, to bring them up in a life of slavery, they wouldn't necessarily know any better. Women too would be placed on these auction blocks. So if families weren't torn apart, meaning if they weren't separated back in Africa prior to getting on these slave ships, the auctions were where families would definitely be torn apart. Because remember, what did we say on Wednesday? This was a dehumanizing process. Having members of family together provided hope. And as a slave master or a slave owner, you don't want to give a slave any semblance of hope. You want them to understand their place and understand that they are less than human. So, for those families that did travel across the Atlantic together, many a times those who were purchasing slaves would never look to purchase entire families, to create that sense of uncertainty when they were brought to their plantations. Now, because the slave trade became so common and because slaves became so valuable enough to be considered one of the most lucrative businesses, the slave trade that is, during this time period, one of the things that transpired from it was a common set of merchants and slave ship owners to develop what became known as the triangular trade. A triangle with three sides and three particular points here. The triangular trade was a reference to the goods that would be exchanged as part of the Atlantic slave trade. So if you look at this little map here that I provided for you, you have Africa here, you have North America and Europe. Okay, so if we were to make a triangle, those would really be our 3 points, so to speak. Now, as you see here, a lot of arrows come down here to the Caribbean, so to speak, and that did exist as far as trade to that region of the Western Hemisphere at this time. But for our purposes, when we're talking about the English colonies, what we want to think about specifically, all right, is when ships were coming here to the colonies. So, just to quickly follow along here, as an example, I have here first leg, second leg, and third leg, meaning stop 1, stop 2, and stop 3. All right, so the first leg typically would leave from Africa. This is where slaves would be board on slave ships, and they would travel to North America. So if we were to follow this line here directly, let's just say for argument's sake, Virginia. All right, their slaves would be placed on auction blocks, their slaves would be sold, and if you're a slave ship owner, you could go right back to Africa and sail back and keep going back and forth, or you could look to make even more money. And the money that those slave traders got from auction blocks, they would use to purchase raw materials. Okay, so things like tobacco or sugar, it says here cotton, indigo, rice, anything, so to speak. Those raw materials could be purchased and they could go back here to Europe. So in our case, speaking to the English colonies, you get a merchant that or a slave trader that sells their slaves. They use that money, and now they're putting on their ship not slaves, but all these raw materials to go to point 2, so to speak. So get my little highlighter here. All right, to Europe here. Okay, and then after the raw materials were sold, the idea would be then to go back to Africa to purchase more slaves. Okay, but this time going from Europe to Africa were a lot of manufactured goods. Okay, so whether those goods were guns, whether those goods were clothing, uh, desks, chairs, anything that was manufactured and things that the continent of Africa didn't typically have at a readily available place, these things were brought down to be sold, but a lot of times traded for humans. Okay, so when we're talking about the triangular trade, we are in fact talking about these three very specific points here. And again, just to emphasize here on the map, okay, you'll notice here on the bottom here that every voyage was different. And now what do I mean by that? Different in the fact that maybe a ship would leave Virginia and first go to Europe. All right, some ships went from Europe to bring manufactured goods here, raw materials purchased sometimes coming down here. Okay, so my example, first leg, second leg, third leg, it is the most common. All right, but really no voyage was the same because every slave ship owner could determine where they went if they wanted to go. A lot of times you wouldn't see slaves going from Africa to Europe directly because it was the colonies that were in need of the most slaves here. Okay, but you see those 3 points here again forming that triangle. Just very quickly, this map here is another example of the triangular trade. This time talking about a lot more goods, just instead of saying raw material, slaves, and manufactured goods. All right, but as you could see, making the point here again using my my red highlighter here. Okay, from Africa to North America, from North America to Europe, from Europe to Africa, those 3 points there. In all honesty, talking about the triangular trade as part of the Atlantic trade system, this would be an excellent part 2 on a Chapter 3 test potentially, as far as being able to describe the Atlantic slave trade and more specifically the triangular trade. You know, what would be an example of a manufactured good going from Europe to Africa, or an example of a raw material going from North America, say for argument's sake, Virginia, to England or Bristol or London here, cities in England. So this would be a very good part to think about, and obviously there's further explanation to that in your iBook. Someone had come up to me on Wednesday and asked me a really good question, and my answer to it is that we would get to it in the notes. So this is where we're getting to it in the notes. Because as I mentioned earlier, it was only really in the English colonies where slaves would be slaves for life. And the question is why? Because in other cultures and other countries, they weren't. And the answer is very simple. It was due to plantations. Because these plantations were so large, they required a tremendous amount of labor. They required a tremendous amount of people to work because the plantations wanted to be profitable, and certainly they were. So when we think about slavery and the growth of slavery in the English colonies, it is truly tied and linked to plantations. Now we can say, what if? What if there weren't plantations in the South? Would there be as many slaves here in the English colonies? Now, while I can't say for certain, I can say that there is a good possibility, had plantations not become such a part of the English colonial culture, there probably wouldn't have been as many slaves. All right, because as I have here, the Southern economy depended on slaves. Okay, these slave owners were not going to be going out and hiring 50 people a week, paying them an hourly wage to work. They weren't going to do that, which is why slaves became more convenient. I mentioned in the last section indentured servants. It didn't make sense to have people work for a certain amount of years, then to only turn around and give them land. These slave owners owed slaves nothing, and they were going to make sure that they were going to get the most out of them in order to ensure that they were going to be profitable. Now, One of the big things that comes here in the colonies is also a negative impact of the Atlantic slave trade, which is the idea of racism. Here in the English colonies, many English settlers, particularly white male landowners, felt as though that they were superior to those who were of African descent, specifically slaves. And that is racism, the idea that one race is superior to another, or that one race is inferior to another. And in this case, specifically, talking about white male landowners, English settlers, in comparison to Africans who were coming here as slaves. And a lot of tension is going to be built up, and in particular in the South, obviously, because that's where plantations were. Now, very important to understand, we made this, I pointed this out in chapter 2, that Mason-Dixon line that separated Pennsylvania and Maryland. By the 1750s, approximately 10% of slaves lived north of Maryland. So they lived north of that Mason-Dixon line. 90% obviously lived south. When we're talking about live south of Maryland, we're talking about the likes of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, but also to include Maryland. Those are the southern colonies. Those are the colonies that have the Tidewater region. So there wasn't as much of a demand in the Middle and New England colonies because there weren't plantations. There wasn't a need to have slaves. Were there slaves? Yes, certainly there is. But what we will see really leading up to the Revolution and even almost immediately thereafter, most colonies, then states, are going to eventually outlaw slavery or is looking to see a gradual end to it. So what we'll do now is, what I'm going to ask that you guys do now is to start working on assignment 3.3b, which has been sent to you via e-backpack. It is your homework that is due on Monday, but wanting to leave at least half the class for you guys to work on that, so hopefully you don't have that many. There are 11 questions. You should have enough time over the rest of class to finish, but if you don't, obviously I would ask that you finish for homework. What we're going to do is we will have a quiz on Tuesday on sections 2 and 3. So quiz will be next Tuesday, and then next Thursday will be your chapter 3 test. So just so that you guys can start planning accordingly, quiz on Tuesday, test on Thursday. So Monday when I get back, what we'll do is we'll wrap up with section 3 here. I do want to leave a point to be in class to wrap up with this section. And then obviously section 4, not too long, so most likely we'll even be starting our next chapter by Wednesday. All right, guys, make sure you say thank you to your sub. Make sure that you work on your correct assignment, and make sure you guys have a great weekend. All right, and I'll see you guys on Monday. Take care.